the reason Israel's a problem is because I don't see any reason why um, America would have to create these kind of conflicts in the Middle East in recent years. Uh,
To remain hegemonic.
well, and yeah, well, to create them in such a way that, and then allow or create the influx of refugees into European countries, and then sow that kind of chaos and social strife in those countries. It doesn't seem to be in line with keeping, the West best and on top. If you want your part of the world, your little corner of the world, to remain on top, then surely one of your primary goals would be to uh, make sure that your societies in your part of the world are stable,
Reasonably stable, yeah.
reasonably stable. You don't want any kind of social kind of chaos and collapse, if you know what I mean, or into infighting amongst not just amongst your own people. That's not good for you as a world power. You're destabilizing yourself effectively.
And you risk bringing in new parties that become new governments that say things like, you know what, we're going to get out of NATO.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Well, that would be totally against U.S. interests, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's like that doesn't seem to be the agenda, or certainly we've moved into an era when the agenda of keeping the West best and on top isn't the agenda anymore. The agenda, there seems to be it seems to be deductible, or it seems to follow logically that someone either they put it down to complete fecklessness, which doesn't really jive with how smart these people are, but they put it down to that, or you put it down to that someone has an agenda to actually bring destabilization and social chaos to Western countries. Because like I said, there's no need for the US to engage in the kind of wars that have created this situation in order to maintain its hegemony. The only thing, like we've been saying, the only thing that kind of those kind of destructive wars in the Middle East that caused the refugee crisis, that caused the destabilization of Western countries, the only entity that serves or helps or that is happy that that's happening is Israel, because Israel wants Western powers to destroy and regime change as many Muslim countries as possible to Israel's liking, and invariably, like we were saying, because of the perennial Palestinian-Israeli conflict that Israel keeps provoking, you're always going to have a strong current of anti-Israel sentiment in the Middle East, not just among the people, but eventually then among political parties and governments, necessitating Israel to call on the US to say, "Come and get rid of this government because we don't like it, because they don't like us for good reason." So then America goes in, destroys that country, creates refugees that come back to Europe, and then destabilize Europe. And the only one left laughing and rubbing their hands is Israel, as everything collapses around everybody else.
Yeah, it's so pathological, and yet it's so consistent in its duration. The war on terror sprang into Western public discourse after 9/11, of course, but it was up and running at least 10 years in Israel. There had, of course, been so-called suicide bombings that had taken place in Israel, blamed on Palestinians. So they already had a public discourse on the run, up and running, if you like, in Israel, and they called it the war on terror. And today in the war on terror, this happened, and so on. And then, of course, 9/11 happens. And once it's shifted to America, well, the discourse, because of the preceding decades of globalization via America, it takes on the beginning, and then eventually, quite quickly, in fact, it becomes a global war on terror at the level of narrative. Everyone knows about it now.
Yeah, well, that's 9/11 did that, and so 9/11 was amazing in its ability to impose this paradigm shift. You know what I mean, on the entire world, because America was just ticking along, doing its usual imperial kind of thing around the world, but it had an interest in keeping things stable, because ultimately it was about business and America getting good deals everywhere and all that kind of stuff, and remaining on top from an economic point of view. So, but 9/11 just forced their hand into creating what we have today, and you could even say 9/11 created Donald Trump. Created the conditions by which Donald Trump appeared. You know, I mean, 9/11. You keep people. There's just
And
the meme 9/11, 9/11, 9/11, 9/11, 9/11 France. Well, it kind of is. You know, if you look back to that day, it totally changed. And look at everything that's happened as a result of 9/11. If it continues on the way, 9/11 will go down in history as the thing that fucked up, that totally destroyed pretty much everything.
yeah,
Yeah, at least in the Western world. You leave China out and all that kind of stuff. But if the Western world goes down, most of the world will go down as well, at least to one extent or another. Some places it will be okay, but it's also interconnected. And 9/11 was just a really, 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 really bad idea.
and someone. I mean, when it gets down to who exactly, there's one figure who he's unusual. Normally, you mentioned the term eminence grise. You would normally imagine this is someone from the shadow, but here's a guy who's been the prime minister off and on of Israel for almost as long as Putin. Benjamin Netanyahu, he keeps recurring as being a central figure in this. I don't want to suggest any more than that, but I will just give some perspective on where he's coming from. Because his father was a kind of he was a top academic. He was an academic professor emeritus at Cornell University in the United States. Before that, he'd been with Jabotinsky, the Zionist movement in the 20s. He, in fact, was one of the first to emigrate from Eastern Europe to then mandate Palestine in 1920. So he was there. Then he went to the United States. Then he, of course, went back to Israel. And this is, by the way, why Netanyahu has an American accent. He was born and raised in the United States initially, anyway. So there's a little bit of I'm going to ask Gotti to bring this article up. It's a Haaretz article. I think it's from this year. This is about his father primarily. He's only recently died at 102. I want you to scroll down and find the paragraph beginning in a televised interview 2 years ago. I'm going to read it out at the same time. It's 3 paragraphs. I'll give you some insight into Netanyahu's mindset. Okay, so here we go. In a televised interview recently, Netanyahu, Bibi, the son, uttered a sentence which distilled his worldview. Here we go. We are very simply in danger of extermination today. Not just existential danger, but truly in danger of extermination. They think that the extermination, the Holocaust, is over. It isn't. It goes on all the time. I've always said that a necessary condition for the existence of any living body and for a nation is the ability to identify a danger in time, a characteristic which our nation, Israel, lost in the diaspora. You taught me, Father, how to correctly view reality and to understand what it contains within it and draw the necessary conclusions. It certainly wasn't an easy thing for you because there were always those who did not see as you did, ridiculed, laughed at, or belittled your conclusions. That's a reference to his father being... Obviously, he was in with some of the key people in the founding of Israel, but he was always considered an extremist among his peers. Anyway, so when we get a little further down here,
The same
foresight led father to say dozens of years ago that the threat to world peace would emerge from the same parts of the Muslim world where oil, terrorism, and nuclear go together. And it is also what led him to tell me in the early 1990s that the Muslim extremists would not rest and would attempt to bring down the Twin Towers in New York, a prediction that I included in one of my books in 1995. It's Netanyahu, it's
So
his father, his brother
his
was
father
also...
in the early 1990s told him that Muslims would attempt to bring down the Twin Towers.
The thing is, that may not have been a hard prediction to make if that was said after the first bombing of the World Trade Center, which happened in 93. So in a sense, 9/11, yeah, opened the floodgates, but in a way 9/11 wasn't the first act in the play, you know?
Yeah, but
there
still,
were preceding steps.
But that's very specific, like, you know. I mean, there's plenty of big, tall buildings in America, you know. Why would you say that? That's suspicious, very suspicious, you know. Well, actually, it reminds me of this guy, Daniel Pipes, that we talked about earlier on, that is funding Tommy Robinson and funding the extreme right in the UK. 4 months before September 11th, 2001, he wrote in the Wall Street Journal that Al-Qaeda was planning new attacks on the US and that Iranian operatives helped arrange advanced training for Al Qaeda personnel in Lebanon, where they learned, for example, how to destroy large buildings. You know, there's probably other quotes from other Israelis and different people in positions to know that say the same thing. And if you put them together, you know, it's hard to just dismiss the idea of kind of prior knowledge, you know.
Hmm.
On the and if you know on the part of Israelis, it's hard to dismiss the idea of, and of course it would fit very well with what we said earlier on, which is that Israel has an extremely strong interest in making Muslims look bad,
The world over.
and also in leveraging American military power in order to, you know, deal with the Muslims.
Mm.
And then, you know, it's just a terrible conflict of interest going on there, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, if you see that happens, you know, and you follow that logic, and then you jump forward to today and you see that Israeli organizations and Israeli, you know, former Israeli foreign ministers, as in the case of in this guy Daniel Pipes' think tank, the Middle East Forum, the director of it is a former Israeli foreign minister, and that today people like that who were talking about 9/11, you know, with apparent some level of foreknowledge or suspicion about it, that today they are encouraging the division in European societies. That's a direct result of 9/11 and the influx of refugees that came from the wars that were initiated because of 9/11. It just gets a bit freaky, you know.